from just outside the Empire City at the crossroads to the northeast. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are and whenever you are, this is your premier podcast for all things unknown, not media, and I'm your host, JP. Welcome to episode 4 of Not Media, and today we are going to be switching gears a little bit. I know we've spent the past couple episodes discussing the UAP, UFO phenomenon over the past and, up until the modern day with some testimony and some shocking revelations from whistleblowers such as David Grush. We also focused a little bit on Roswell, so that's a monumental case in the world of UFO research. This story that I have today for you is absolutely fascinating. It's going to be switching gears from the topic that we've been discussing because this has to deal with afterlife communication. So a lot of people suspect, and a lot of people have had ghost stories and have had claims they've communicated with loved ones through mediums such as psychics and such. But the thing about this next story that changed the game for me is that in all these years of hearing ghost stories and phenomenon related to ghosts, I have never once either witnessed or heard of anybody talking about a ghost case or a spirit case where there was actually a physical trace left over from the incident. And that's what we have in this situation. So this kind of really changed the gears for me as what I thought, spiritual research or ghost research. I know a lot of people have seen things. The problem up until this point is that it almost becomes like a religious experience. It's like religion is something very much personal to the person who believes it because they've had an experience or they've had faith and their prayers have been answered, or however they talk to God. So a lot of times that deep connection with a person and their spirit or God or, whatever they believe is something that means something to them. And I'm not saying only them because, there's more than there's many religions that, are praised and worshiped in groups. But, when people have like a religious experience and they say like, oh, God spoke to me or, the hand of God saved my life, like a lot of times those are things that, the person that's telling the story believes because of the context the story was put through them, so if they had a dream or something, or if they had a vision, if they had, it's hard to corroborate something like that because if that person had the dream or that person had the vision or that person heard the voice, it's like anybody could say anything. And I'm not saying these things don't happen. I'm just saying that it's hard to prove. You could claim that, anything has happened to you as it has happened for decades concerning the UFO phenomena. And for many, many years, people have just been saying, oh, well, it was convenient, like that's been the thing, oh, this person claims they were abducted by aliens. Oh, why does it always happen to somebody who's a farmer out in the middle of some, plain somewhere in the middle of the night or out in the middle of the mountains to somebody who's been drinking whiskey or something, or moonshine. There's always been this negative stigma around these sorts of incidents where if somebody claims that they've had an experience or they've seen something, the first thing somebody's going to try to do, the first thing that it's like the first gamut that they have to run through is a question of their integrity. And I don't think that's I'm not sure if it's got the same sort of stigma, but it's, there definitely still is some sort of a stigma. Somebody's claimed that they saw something, that wasn't really there. They say, oh, I saw a figure walking around. I saw a ghost, like people, there's a certain contingent of people, which, I don't think is necessarily a small contingent that is automatically going to put you into a category of like, well, I'm not sure if this person's tied together too tight. And, I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just saying it is what it is. And I've experienced this myself with UFO research. I remember I was working years ago before my career in law enforcement and everything that I did, up until about the past decade or so. I was working at a temporary agency, and I remember meeting this one kid from the office. He was a believer in UFOs. We were talking about aliens and UFOs or crop circles, and then this other guy kind of chimed in. He goes, "Oh boy, you're one of those guys, right?" And obviously he was rolling his eyes at me, thinking like, "Oh, this guy's like not put together too tight." It's one of these space cadets that believes in these things like UFOs and aliens and Bigfoot. You just group them all in the same category. Ghosts. You're just one of those guys. Those guys that aren't too well grounded on this earth. Maybe like a little. Not playing, either not playing with a full deck or, just some negative connotation or, not put together too tight, not too sharp, there's always automatically going to be some negative stigma about it. And I was like, I forget what my answer to him was. I was like, oh yeah, I am one of those guys. I'm one of those guys who really does my homework, and I'm one of those guys who knows what he's talking about before he opens his mouth. Yep, I'm one of those guys. So, but the thing about this case right here is that there was physical trace evidence from a paranormal experience dealing with ghosts or spirits. And again, I've never heard of any situation like this before. And this kind of changed the way that I thought about ghosts and paranormal. Not that I didn't believe it before, but this, definitely brought my belief up to another level for sure. Because, once you start factoring in that there's trace evidence related to a paranormal event and there's no way to explain that evidence whatsoever with science, we start kind of backing ourselves into a corner or opening ourselves up to a whole new universe of another reality, and there's truth to it. And just because mainstream science, schools, colleges, professors aren't going to be acknowledging something's going on doesn't mean that it's not going on. It just means that something may be going on that's just a little bit ahead of the game. And more than likely, that's what's going on right here. This story, and as we've seen, more than likely, as we've now basically are on the cusp of proving beyond a shadow of a doubt with the new whistleblowers and the UFO phenomenon, that people of the likes of Bob Lazar, Jesse Marcel, Lieutenant Corso, these people that have been downplayed over the decades and have been ridiculed. Anytime anybody gets an opportunity to throw some dirt or throw some water on them, they do. And their names have been trashed for all these years. And Bob Lazar stuck in there for all these years, after breaking the story about Area 51. And lo and behold, within the past 10 years, what was it, 2013, when the CIA finally came clean and said, oh, yeah, we do have this thing called Area 51. And everybody from who was a proponent of Bob Lazar's like, as we've been talking about for the past 25 years. And, then all of a sudden more testimony. Oh, there was that a security guard came forward, and I think pictures came out of those hand scanners that measure the metacarpals, measure the ratio of the bones in your hands, and that's how they identify you like a fingerprint. You grab this hand scanner, and based on the ratio of your bones in your hands, each bone and how they piece together, that is your specific ID, and that's how they would get clocked into this Area 51. They were like, oh, that really existed, as Bob Lazar said it existed 25 years ago. So, like, his story starts to make more and more and more sense about, maybe this guy was just telling the truth. Maybe it was just that simple. From the day one, he was telling 100% the truth of what he knew and what he experienced. So now, we're circling back around to all these people that have had paranormal ghost experiences. And it looks like this story that I'm talking about today with the book An Atheist in Heaven written by Paul Davids and Dr. Gary Schwartz, documents a encounter or multiple encounters with the producer or editor of Famous Monsters of Filmland, Forrest J. Ackerman. And it's absolutely amazing. I mean, there's multiple accounts in this book. Just a little bit of background on Ackerman was that, as I stated, he produced and edited Famous Monsters of Filmland. He also had a penchant for writing puns and plays on words. Ackerman passed away in 2008 on December 4th at the age of 92. I had originally tracked this episode and I took extensive notes. I took over 6 pages of notes detailing this book and all the occurrences, including the documentaries, the 3 documentaries around the book, An Atheist in Heaven by Dr. Gary Schwartz and Paul Davids. And it was surrounding the life of Ackerman and these apparent contacts that he had with Davids and people around Davids. So I don't know what happened, but there was some sort of glitch when I was tracking. And due to that, I lost all of my audio when it came to doing this episode. So, after doing about an hour and a half of the podcast, I realized that only about the beginning was saved. So I don't know, because I did an interview with Davids, if I'm going to retrack, an hour and a half to 2 hours of audio extensively going over the book and within detail, because I do have the notes for that. So maybe in lieu of doing that, I will focus on, out of 142 strange events that surrounded Ackerman, Davids, and the circle of people that they who knew Ackerman. Maybe I'll just focus on like the top 2 incidents which sold this or these occurrences to me, and I could not explain them, or it seemed like they were so highly improbable that they had to have had some sort of a basis in contact with this guy Ackerman, who generated these phenomena. So I'm just going to, like I said, instead of getting into all this background and all this information, you could hear my interview with Davids in episode 5. And then you could check the book out, An Atheist in Heaven, and you could also watch the free documentaries, Afterlife Project 1, 2, and 3 on YouTube. So we're going to go to March 18th, 2008 in Santa Fe, New Mexico. After Davids had went to a casino, he was sick afterwards, and he had a set of tax documents on his bed. There were 24 tax documents. He went and he used the bathroom. He came out, and when he came out, there was fresh ink on the documents. He had not put that ink there, and those documents had been printed 2 hours prior. It was not a water drip nor a smear, as some skeptics such as Michael Shermer were trying to say. He saw 4 words precisely blotted out in 2 different levels of opacity. The first 2 words were "spoke to," and the second 2 words were "Joe Amodi." There was a mention to Joe Amodi earlier in that documentary, or those documents, I'm sorry, where he stated that, I think like wrote Joe Amodi or emailed. There was some other reference to Joe Amodi, but Joe Amodi was a DVD distributor who distributed, or Davids was trying to get to distribute Jesus in India, which was a film he directed in 2005, which regarded the years of like 15 to 30 of Jesus, where apparently he spent some time in India, or at least that this DVD is claiming that. But not to get too far into that, his dealing with Joe Amodi was very brief. He spoke to Joe Amodi. He was a DVD distributor, and Joe Amodi did not distribute his DVD, so he wasn't sure why these words on this tax document were blotted out. There was some context where he started trying to put two and two together, and the context was a week prior they had done a celebration of life ceremony where some influential people spoke. I mean, Ackerman was friends with Ray Bradbury, Peter Jackson, who was the director of Lord of the Rings. They spoke at his celebration of life. I mean, apparently he put Ray Bradbury on, in the sense that I think he gave Ray Bradbury his first shot at writing a story with somehow associated with famous monsters of filmland. And Stephen King was also friends with Ackerman. I think Ackerman helped Stephen King out also. So there were some big names that this guy Ackerman had influenced and was connected with. Anyhow, this celebration was somewhere around March 7th, 2008, which was about 11 days prior to the what Davids is calling obliteration incident, because he's saying it's not a smear, because a smear is very undeliberate. He said this, and you could look at this on my video or on my YouTube page. I have a video when I interviewed Davids. He showed or gave me some documents to post, and one of that is the original document without the ink obliteration and the document after the ink obliteration. And he was trying to figure out, like, make sense of who put this obliteration there, who Joe Amodi is, or why Joe Amodi was being referenced. He definitely knew something strange had happened. I think he even said he called out in the room if there was any unseen forces to, maybe if in the event it might have been evil or something. He knew something very strange had just happened, because there was wet ink on a piece of paper. It clearly looked like somebody put the ink there, and it only happened when he turned his back and went to go use the bathroom. So it was something very strange. And he started focusing his sights on Ackerman because of this incident that occurred on March 7th, 2008. Two Canadian filmmakers, one by the name of Michael McDonald and the other by Ian Johnson, who had created a documentary commemorating Ackerman's life, went to Ackerman's crypt and knocked on the crypt door, thinking it would be funny because, if Ackerman was alive, he had a sense of humor. When they got back to their hostel, they went to go log into like some social media website, such as Facebook or something. A CAPTCHA code popped up stating Ackerman 000, and it was a very fine variation of how Ackerman actually spelled his name. CAPTCHA is a acronym for completely automated public Turing test to tell computers and humans apart. So the name CAPTCHA by the name of CAPTCHA. If anybody is familiar with what a CAPTCHA box is, it's like a PNG or a JPEG with a bunch of squiggly lines, like A, F, 3, 2, squiggly line. You know, it's a picto that a computer wouldn't be able to recognize. So if there's a spam bot trying to log into your account or hack your account and use 100 different passwords, CAPTCHA screens that out by stopping, you know, if it's a computer, they're not going to be able to read what the letters or numbers in that CAPTCHA box. So it turns out, and if you think about it, you know, I used to have a band. This is a side note, and I used to play or used to log into a lot of social media accounts, MySpace, Facebook, and countless times. And I've had to count countless CAPTCHA boxes, and I've never seen a name pop up. I've never seen 3 numbers pop up next to a name. And that's just a name, never mind the name of the person who you just went and knocked on their crypt door, grave door within the past hour. So this is the odds of something like this occurring would be like effectively zero, infinitesimally small. And on top of that, just as one of the men who didn't really believe in the paranormal had this epiphany, like, oh my God, you know, like, is this guy really dead? I think he even said that out loud. He said, yeah, Ian Johnson said out loud, is he really dead? Just as he said that, his computer, which was across the room, came out of sleep mode, and a screensaver of Ackerman when he was 4 years old popped up on the screen, and a little voice said, in a child's voice, "Oh my God, no way," which was associated with a voice clip that could have been found on YouTube and was found on YouTube, but his computer was not connected to the internet. So there's no way that his voice or this clip should have been on that computer. And that would have been extremely odd, like extremely, extremely odd. So if you were to take both of these occurrences in context, stacked right next to each other, especially almost after like the answer to his question, is he really dead? Then the other computer comes alive or comes awake and has that happen. I mean, the odds of these two events happening side by side, like each one of them, the odds of it happening would be extremely, extremely odd. Never mind happening right back to back next to each other. I would say the odds of that happening would be effectively zero. And even, you know, less than just one of them happening, never mind both of them happening. So anyhow, David started putting 2 and 2 together and said to himself, oh, maybe this is associated with that weird situation that these guys explained to me the other day and or the other week, and you know, maybe this has to do with Ackerman. So he was just trying to do his homework on this ink obliteration or this ink blot, and he spoke with a guy named Joe, a Hawaiian man named Joe Mo, who was Ackerman's caretaker and good friend right up to the point where he died. And he was going to ask Joe Mo, hey, can I get some documents that Ackerman actually edited, so I could see what sort of edits he did. So maybe there's some sort of comparison I can make between Ackerman's edits and these edits on the ink blot or ink obliteration that I appeared in my room on this night at his vacation house in Santa Fe. So just as he was about to ask Joe Mo for these documents so he could try to do some comparisons, Joe Mo cut him off and said that Ackerman appeared to him in an extremely lucid dream, almost as if it wasn't a dream and realer than real life. You know, he was in a room, he kind of dozed off, he saw Ackerman, and the context was Ackerman thanked Joe Mo for putting together this celebration of life ceremony. It looks as if he even joked around with Joe Mo. He said, when he asked how the ceremony was, he says, oh, it was fair. And that was a little inside joke because one time somebody went to go visit his mansion and he had something called the ghost book instead of a guest book. And the guy made a comment, oh, your collection of sci-fi memorabilia was fair. And then he had over like 300,000 pieces, like one of the most extensive collections on the planet. So he just thought it was funny. Like at the time it was like a slap in the face, but then it became an inside joke. And then afterwards he said, no, it was really like the 9th wonder of the world. And then Joe Mo knew he wouldn't say 8th wonder of the world because he used to joke around that 8th wonder of the world was King Kong. So, there were 2 inside jokes right there. So after David's heard this account of Joe Mo talking about how Ackerman came to visit him in this lucid experience, which was kind of like a dream or like a twilight between dreaming and daydreaming, that he realized that, oh, this document spoke to Joe Amodei, Amodei. Ackerman was very well known for making plays on words and jokes on words, like when he would edit his famous Monsters of Filmland, he would say spectacular, and it would be like Ack, A-C-K, because his name was Ackerman, and he would put the word Ack in the middle of spectacular. He was constantly doing stuff like that. So it was completely in his sense of humor and style to be making references within words, like plays on words. So spoke to, highlighted lightly, and then darked out for emphasis, Joe Amodei. And if you look at the last name Modi, Joe, M-O-E, the second and third letter, then the last letter. So it was a play within the name Amodei, spoke to Joe Mo. And then it made sense what was happening, because Joe Mo had this, almost it seemed the way he was talking about, like a life-changing type of lucid experience where Ackerman came to visit him. So he felt that it was almost real. Well, it was so real, like realer than real life. So, a lot of people claim they have these events happen to them. And I've had one type of event like that with a family member who passed away, but this is super common. A lot of people have these type of lucid dreams, especially when somebody that they love passes away and they feel like they come to visit them, tell them everything's all right. They're not weird, they're not strange, they're not scary, they're comforting. These are very comforting experiences, as was the experience that I had. So, not uncommon for these type of things to happen, but up until this situation, these experiences are very much like, oh, you had a dream. There's no way to disprove what you had. It's just a dream, But in this case now, we've had some sort of a physical trace case referencing somebody who came to visit somebody else in a dream. And this is not made up. This is real life. This guy has David's has a document. So, like I said, I'm not going to start getting into too much detail now, because I originally tracked this, in my style, hour and 45-minute podcast on this matter. And I have a lot of notes here, and a lot of details from the books, but we're just going to kind of jump forward and talk about, we spoke about the captcha box, we spoke about the computer coming awake, we spoke about the ink obliteration. I think we're just going to get right into some of the things that might have happened around this stack of papers and the chemical analysis. And then I think from there, I'm just going to kind of wrap it up and kind of forward you to, if you want to listen to my interview with David's, and if you want to go to his website, we'll just leave it at that. So I'll get into that right now. Turns out David's, by coincidence, had a first cousin, who unfortunately has since passed away, but at the time was able to help him. He was a famous chemist, and his name was Dr. J. Siegel. He was chairman, Department of Chemistry at Purdue University in Indianapolis. And him and his assistant, Gina Ammerman, who was a senior graduate student, took this document with the ink obliteration on it, and they were going to chemically analyze it to try to figure out, get to the bottom of, like, where did this ink come from? Is there a way that science can explain this? And it turns out he had an associate who didn't even want to be on film, because David's originally wasn't going to do the book, but I think he just did the book to make sure it was open this situation up to a whole new audience. But he just did the documentary at first, and there was so much going on in the documentary. Eventually, they're like, well, you can turn this into a book, because he was just going to just film everything. And then he realized, well, after he started filming everything, because these were just such strange occurrences, that he turned it into a series of documentaries, 1, 2, and 3, and that's the Afterlife Project. And then he realized that he should make a book also, because there was so much information. So one of Dr. Siegel's associates didn't even want to be on camera, didn't want to be associated with this investigation once he found out what it was all about. Didn't even want to know the results from their findings. Didn't care. He was so scared from being somehow tied to this matter. He thought this could be something that would affect his career, and that's sadly how a lot of people think. You start thinking outside the lines and the boxes that we're kind of drawn into in our lives, and they don't have the courage to think outside of that, which is really sad. So even Gina, she thought, maybe an animal had peed on your documentary, a document, So it's almost like people are so locked into this is reality, and you can't think outside these lines. And if you do, it has to be explained. And somehow we have to draw whatever happened to you back into the lines that we're designed to think in. And there's nothing outside these lines. So that's even when you look at the document, you can clearly see that it was clearly an intentional highlight of these words on this document. It couldn't have been an animal peeing on a page. Couldn't have been, these are far outside the scope of how this document could have been altered. But people, they're like, well, it's impossible. It's impossible for this to just happen when you walked out of a room. So there has to be something to explain it, like an animal walking into the room when you were outside the room and maybe peeing on the document like that, might make sense of something, because we have to force ourselves back inside this box. So it turns out, after they did extensive chemical testing, they tried to dissolve the ink with solvents. They used gas chromatography. It didn't match any of the inks that they knew, or anything that they knew made paint from. Strange occurrences happened in the laboratory. A computer popped out of sleep mode, and nobody had touched the computer when they were in their laboratory. I'm kind of just skimming by my notes, all of this side note stuff. Later on, it looks like Dr. Allison from the College of New Jersey, which was an associate of Dr. Siegel, tried to analyze these because apparently it was beyond the scope of what Dr. Siegel was able to do. They couldn't find an answer to this. Just a little fun fact, side note here. I guess I'll go into some of my notes. It was Ackerman who coined the term sci-fi from hi-fi, and then it was eventually changed to SYFY, sci-fi. So that's a very common term now within the you say world of sci-fi. I mean, he was the one that coined that word, and he was the first one to dress up at a science fair. He dressed up at the 1939 First World Scientific Fair in New York, and I guess he was dressed up like, how they do it like Comic-Cons now. I mean, that's hugely popular. He was the first one to do it. This guy, there's a lot of firsts with him, and he was a, huge influence to a lot of people. So anyhow, just getting back to these strange occurrences, when Dr. Allison put these papers under a briefcase, under a chair, and he left the room, he came back into the room, they were scattered all over the floor, no fans in the room, no means for these papers to be moving about. A clock, and this is caught, I think, during the Afterlife Project 2. It was being filmed on the documentary, and it started chiming and was ticking. And he had had that clock for years, and 6 years after, it had never chimed or clicked before nor after that documentary was being filmed. and he didn't wind it with a key. And he thought maybe at the time, maybe it was because of the heat, but out of years, let's say however many years, 7, 8, 9, 10 years or whatever, this clock was sitting there, had not chimed or clicked once. But yet, when they were filming this documentary about Ackerman and they had these documents in the house, all of a sudden this clock started ticking. And that was extremely odd because he knew where the key was and nobody else had touched the key to wind this clock. So this clock shouldn't have been clicking. It shouldn't have been chiming. And there was another time a clock the alarm started going off, and it was exactly at the time Ackerman died. And it was an alarm that they hadn't set. So it just started going off, which was strange. Dr. Allison could not find out what the molecules were. He was a director of forensic chemistry. He said there was evidence of calcium chromate and silver gamma on the first page, but not the second. The obliteration or ink blot was not consistent with wetting a paintbrush and dragging it through ink. So whoever thought that maybe Davids was just lying about this whole thing and fabricated this ink obliteration, it wasn't done with an ink. It wasn't done with a brush. So the beginning was lighter than the end, but the water bled through the paper. He experimented with Dr. Allison experimented with different types of soaps, liquors, common alcohols that would be used around the household, and solvents used for paper chromatography. He even used turpentine because he realized that Davids was a painter and wanted to see, what what sort of solvents, could dissolve this. And, he was doing all sorts of different experiments. I think eventually, if you listen to my interview, they discovered it was consistent with ink that was inside David's vacation house, but the concentration of the ink was extremely more concentrated on the document, and they couldn't figure out how to duplicate that. So this stepped outside of their known means of science to be able to make a line that dark with one stroke or one or however many strokes or however this was done. And these type of edits were consistent with Ackerman and how he would edit his documents. He would make light strokes and he would make dark. He would really cross something out when he meant something. So it was completely consistent when they did actually find documents that he had edited when he was alive. So another thing was he had one of these Furby dolls. He hadn't touched this doll in years. And I don't know if you guys remember, there was like a doll that was supposed to learn phrases. It was a huge craze, I think I forget, like the mid to late 80s, early 90s. And all of a sudden it comes, hadn't had batteries changed in 4 years. The thing starts saying 4E, 4E. And Ackerman used to call himself 4E, Forrest, 4E. And then he would just use the number 4 and the letter E. So extremely strange that this Furby doll wasn't even programmed to say 4E, but yet it would say 4E. And he didn't even touch it. So it was extremely odd. So all these odd occurrences. And then there was a tenant at the Acker mansion after he had moved out, or after he had passed away and his stuff was moved out. And where Ackerman's office used to be, a man saw a shadow of a man on the wall. And a musician, Suzanne Rick, would always have her musical papers scattered about the house every time she would walk out of a room. Dr. Shermer, who's the executive director of Skeptic Society and publisher of Skeptic Magazine, calls this agenticity, or the tendency to infuse patterns with meanings, saying that just because something happens a lot, that it has to be some sort of meaning. But some of these things you really can't explain away. It's just patterns with meanings, because going to log into a CAPTCHA on a computer and have a name pop up that's an exact spelling of the exact person's grave you just knocked on or crypt you just knocked on within the past hour, with 3 zeros, when anytime numbers are in CAPTCHA boxes, they're supposed to be random, and 3 zeros seems very unrandom. So it's like everything about that CAPTCHA was exactly the opposite of what it should have been, which makes it that much more improbable and that much more likely that there was some sort of strange or paranormal meaning behind it. There was a lot, like I said, over 142 incidents of strangeness. And kind of just summing up some of the ongoings. There was an electric EVP, or electric voice phenomena, of the word Lenore, and that was very significant to David's because Ackerman was into Edgar Allan Poe, and when he won his film contest 44 years earlier or something like that, when Ackerman mailed him the letter, there was a picture of an Edgar Allan Poe stamp with a raven on there, and so just a lot of significance to these strange occurrences to the people that they were happening to. Ackerman was a member of something called the Bat Pack, which consisted of Ray Bradbury, Ray Harryhausen, and Ackerman, and he also made David's a unofficial, or I think, member of the Bat Pack at one point. I think he said, without getting into all these strange occurrences. I'll kind of just leave it off with one or two last ones. Right when Davids learned that he was going to have the Afterlife Project put on the Sci-Fi Channel, when he got home, he had this prop of Ackerman's face. It looked just like Ackerman, but I don't think it was intended for that at first, but it was on a mantle I think he said he had it over like an alien head that he had from when he did the movie Roswell. He had this Ackerman face over the alien head, and it was sitting in his computer room, in his editing room, for years, 4 years, untouched. And just as he found out that this documentary, he got really good news because he was really having a hard time getting this documentary off the ground. It was going to be on the Sci-Fi Channel. Just as he found this out, he got home, and that mask was across the room, 8 to 10 feet, laying on the floor. And then his computer automatically shut down, and when it popped back on, there were folders of all pertaining to Ackerman out of, he said, hundreds and hundreds of folders he had on his computer, which never opened by themselves. But somehow his computer just automatically shut down and reopened, and there were automatically, folders about Ackerman. And that was extremely odd. And then when he did the final edit for the documentary, out of 200,000 frames, just as Earl Russell stated, how death is total silence, the film went silent, and the final edit had no sound from the second he said that word, silence, and then the film went silent. So the edit had this anomaly where the film went silent directly in correspondence with death. And the odds of that happening is like 1 in 200,000. And there was no way to explain this. He said everything was a go. Everything was good. Everything was in order. He was supposed to just process it through this program, the final copy. He said it takes about 12 hours. And he said when it came out, it was had this anomaly in there. And then he tried to produce the film again, and it came out just fine. So, and lastly, there was a situation where there was an interview with Ray Bradbury about Ackerman, and they were trying to get it into this documentary, but the hard drive fritzed out on him, and he had to take it. If you ever have to get data recovered, they have these companies that do data recovery, and sometimes it's extremely costly, all depending on what level they have to elevate it to, and it takes a while. So it was going to take him a month and cost him maybe a couple $1,000s if it was even possible to get access to this memory again. And he was so upset, he actually went to Ackerman's crypt and asked Ackerman, like, hey, what can you do for me? I need, you would be upset if we did a documentary about you and Ray Bradbury wasn't in there talking about you. Like, what can you do? Can you help me? I need help. I don't have the time. I don't have a month. The clip is just not going to get put in the documentary. And just basically as he was pulling out of the cemetery, he gets a phone call from the computer company and they say, strangely and unexpectedly, your hard drive just started working again. And another very strange occurrence. So, like I said, the list goes on and on and on. If you want to check Paul David's website out, you can go to www.pauldavids-artist.com and check his links to his books, all his work. If you tune into episode 5, you can listen to my interview with Paul Davids. Thank you all for listening to this episode, and thank you everyone who has chosen a life of service. This is not just military, fire, police, and EMS, but also anyone who has taken their talents and passions and used them for the service and betterment of others and this world. I'm not saying goodbye. I'm saying until next time. This is your host, @NotMedia, JP signing off. Stay well, everyone.